Yat Eshe Mattee Jim and Shenasht Ejedene and Shlon Kia Ani Bashishin. I see that Nashani Gates and Naushinolia 8 out and Enshle. I'm Mattee Jim. I'm of the Zuni people clan, born for the Towering House people clan. I'm originally from a place called Sanaushtin, where my grandmother grew up, and where I'm originally from also, and where I grew up. And that's how I identify myself as a Navajo individual. I also identify in contemporary ways as a strong Native transgender woman. Starting off in the year 2000 is when I started HIV prevention, but before that I was volunteering for Navajo AIDS Network. I worked with prevention specialists back then. Right before that is when I started my sobriety 18 years ago. Really found a purpose in why I wanted to do this, and I think the reason why I did it is because I had a very close friend who was infected with HIV and stuff, and I kind of did the wrong things back in the day. So I worked there for 7 years till 2007. Had an opportunity to move to a big city. Went to Los Angeles for AIDS Project Los Angeles as HIV prevention specialist. I was there for about 2 years. There was a job offer in Albuquerque, so I wanted to move closer to home, be closer to family. So I took this job opportunity at First Nations Community Health Source, and I've been here for about 4 years now. My main focus is to provide information and education to my community and get away from a lot of the stuff that are challenges to our community, especially with cofactors around prevention, like homelessness or poverty or discrimination, violence, stigma. There's a lot of things that are associated to why as a Native person we don't get tested, or why people are not really looking out for their health. And there's a lot of disparities, especially within Native communities. And I feel that it's one step further of addressing stuff like acculturation, assimilation, and also the generational historical trauma within our communities. And a lot of that's not being addressed. They're starting to cover it, but I think we need to go more into it about of things that happened in the past and how that's affecting our health as Native people. Okay, with Native issues, depending on where the person is from, has a lot to do with how someone may feel about themselves. Some coming from a reservation rural setting where there is probably little to no services around HIV prevention or even STDs being talked about. Also the challenge of looking at taboos with the Native communities. When talking about sex, sometimes they feel that it's a taboo, so we don't talk about it. So a lot of that adds to the stigma, adds to why people don't talk about like sex and stuff. So, and seeing dynamics within the Native communities, we're always talking about stigma, and we have a lot to deal with. Within our Native communities, there are a lot of Native individuals who still think that HIV is a gay disease. And also, I think the lack of knowledge adds to that also too. There are a lot of individuals out there who are at risk, and we're trying to reach out to them to get tested, and they're not getting tested, and the whole stigma around testing also too. And then not wanting to know and only saying it's only for a certain population. I think it's a big part of that. Okay, cofactors. I think the biggest cofactor would be substance use. There's a lot of substance use within the Native community. Other cofactors would be poverty within Native communities. A lot of times we look at poverty issue. And then also the identification of poverty also too has to be looked at. And also homelessness. Within our Native communities, the whole identification of homelessness is another thing, because as a Native person you always have a home to go to, especially when you were born. Like for me, I mentioned Sanaushtin, where I'm originally from. That's my home, that's my original home, and idea of homelessness is out the door. So using transient, it would be a better definition. And then also looking at Western views and traditional views also could be a cofactor, because there are a lot of Natives who are still very traditional. They do practice their traditional ways and values, and then we come to Western views and contemporary views, and those are a lot different. And that's a part of that assimilation, and that acculturation could be also a cofactor of putting oneself at risk. Other cofactors could be the health disparities going to a hospital. With Natives, especially with elders who go to the hospital, a lot of times they feel like you go to the only reason why people go to hospitals to die. Other cofactors are unemployment. There's huge unemployment rates within reservation settings. Other cofactors are, especially for Native trans communities, I think would be even just the word survival. The whole discrimination or transphobia that we face, the lateral oppression from our own people, even our own kind that we have to deal with, trying to get a job but being denied a job because of being a trans individual. And I've seen that in several cases. Recently, they did a survey called Injustice at Every Turn. They even did a subcategory of Native American populations that were part of the survey, and that was even more alarming. In the survey, they found that 41% of the respondents were thinking about suicide or attempted suicide, compared to the 1.6% in the national average. And that's like huge. That's crazy. So like with an identity, and I think that's why I introduced myself in the beginning in my native language, is because that's me as a native person first and foremost. That's who I am. And when I identified myself as a strong native trans woman, that's in contemporary and Western views. So I'm Navajo first and foremost. I'm Diné. Within our native communities, especially in the GLBT community, we find that we're using terms that are very contemporary and Western viewed. That's part of that assimilation and the acculturation. And there's so many other cofactors that we have to look at too, especially when you are coming from different areas and different views. Like I said, the reservation, there's distance, there's ways of getting to town, there's ways of getting places compared to urban setting where you can just jump on a bus, use a bus pass and get to where you need to go. But on a reservation setting, you have to hitch a ride. With transphobia, knowing that people are out there that are hating know who you are as an individual. Before I started taking hormones, I was more androgynous, so people would figure out that I was a trans individual. Experiences that I would have before, like going into a store, I would take a deep breath before I went into a store because I knew I would either hear faggot, queer, you're disgusting, you're gross, look at that, it's an it, and all these negative things, and those are part of the transphobia. Because those learned behaviors, if you hear that you're disgusting and you're gross for so long, you're going to start believing that. Or if people continue to put a community down, we start to normalize thinking, okay, well, this is what they're saying about us, so I guess it's true about our community. Like when I first got sober, I was told that, or when I first started drinking, I was told that getting laid, partying, was a part of gay life, and I did that for a number of years until I was 24 and I stopped. Within transphobia, I've encountered a lot of like hateful people, but I'm glad that I was a fighter. I'm glad that I was a person who would stand up, but a lot of times I stood up until I drank. But when I was sober, I was scared. Discrimination comes on all levels. I'm still called a drunk native queen sometimes, even though I'm sober 18 years. Or I hear others talk about my brothers and sisters who are still drinking out in the streets, like, oh, they're just drunks. That's what Native people do, is they drink. That's what Native people do. And that stereotype and labels are still there. And a lot of times what's not really talked about is where those things came from. That attributed from the generational historical trauma and those cofactors. With transphobia, a lot of that happens within our community affects us in so many ways that we put ourselves at risk to have unprotected sex because we feel worthless sometimes. There are times when I've blacked out, when I drank, that I know that I had sex with somebody, but I didn't know who I had sex with. With the transphobia that happens, as a trans person, we internalize that. We start feeling that we're not capable to function sometimes until we address those issues, until we step back and say, this is what I'm doing, I need to help myself, and we start empowering ourselves. And I think I learned that with also the values that I have as a Navajo person. My culture and my tradition really was a part of that, empowering myself. Deal with transphobia at times. I don't want to go through the ugliness that was said about me, because even though I'm sober, even though I'm empowered, even though I know I'm stronger, sometimes I think back on those words and it still does get to me. Or sometimes when I hear it, it triggers and it still hurts. Transphobia from all levels, not just society and populations, but also from family. That rejection also is part of that transphobia. Being Native American is another cofactor to dealing with that transphobia, not just from society, but also my own people in general, in dealing with that, like educating my community. Like I think there's complex things to what we're talking about, like me being transgender, me being Native American, being Navajo. Depending on who I'm with or where I'm at, it could jump from one category to another. Some of the personal things that I went through around HIV risk, the cofactor of substance use. I was very sexually active, so when I would go drinking, I would pick up men or go with men, and just to get that. And that also, I think, attributed from me not being accepted by my father, that I substituted not getting the love I got from my father and slept with all these men, and substituted thinking that when they slept with me, they loved me, which put myself at risk, because there were times when I didn't have protected sex. There was condoms available. Sometimes I may have not used them when I was in a drunken stupor. And I know when I was coherent, I would use condoms. Alcohol was the biggest cofactor for me. With sleeping with these men, I substituted something I didn't have. So to this day, I'm working on that, and I'm really glad that I'm working on that. I feel that it goes back to the behaviors. One's behavior, even my behavior, because there are times when I may feel lonely or unwanted and stuff, that I might trust someone and might have unprotected sex with them. But I'm just going to take it each day at a time. And that's what I've learned, is to take each day at a time. But use the tools that I have now to protect myself. All the way. I became sexually active when I was 12. I don't feel like I want to put myself at risk anymore. Advice that I would give young Native trans girls: keep waking up each day knowing that things will change, things can change. My personal experiences taught me to be a better person, regardless of how negative they were and the craziness that I went through. I'm living the life that I am today because I made a decision to change. Young Native trans girls can make that decision to change and work on themselves. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some energy. But we do get out of situations that we're in. Sometimes I look back thinking, well, I would have been dead if I kept going, because I contemplated suicide. My last drink. Mattee Jim sitting right now doing this interview would not be here. The Mattee Jim that's doing this. And sometimes when the work that I do, people say I do great work, but sometimes I don't look at it that way. I just do the work that I do because I'm that person that does that work. If you want to change, you'll change. And not just with the trans community, but also my Native community across the board. There's so many shit that's happened to us. We can get out of it. We can change. We can make behavior change. We can make behavior modifications. Challenges that come across, I think for us as trans individuals, sometimes the biggest thing is relationships. Learning how to deal with relationships. And by relationships, I mean having a boyfriend or having a girlfriend. Having a relationship with someone compared to relationships with family. And that varies. I'm fortunate to have total acceptance now from my family, my extended family. HIV prevention in reservation rural settings. Funding, I think, is the biggest challenge for our care services and HIV prevention services within our reservations. Their transportation just to get food to survive on. Signing up for different programs to help them in assistance. Also, within Native tribes, how do we advocate for our own HIV prevention dollars to the government instead of being funneled through certain entities? Why can't we be directly funded to do the work that we do within agencies? We work with less dollars, little dollars that we can, to be creative, but it'd be great to have more money to get the funding that we need to do the things that we do. And then also, I think with prevention, we have to get agencies that will work with the population, who know the population and possibly come from the population. With the Native communities and prevention, getting the buy-in of leaders within our community. We have tribal members, we have tribal councils, we have tribal leaders that are there, and having them be at the forefront for us and support us. And then also, I don't want to say this, but getting the right people to work in the prevention field, especially in the Native community, would be the best thing also too. Like, let's hire people who are passionate about the job that they do. Let's hire people who want to help the people, our people.